Good evening. My name is Ross Jordan. I'm the interim director and curatorial manager at the Jane Addams Whole House Museum. The museum is located on the campus of the University of Illinois, Chicago, and draws upon the legacy of international peace activist, suffragist, and the feminist Jane Addams, and the other social reformers who lived and worked alongside their immigrant neighbors to expand democracy on the near west side of Chicago. The museum connects progressive era and Hull House settlement history to present day social justice issues. I want to welcome you to Hull House's Museum's Women's History Month event. Honestly, every month is Women's History Month at Hull House. And every day at the museum, we highlight the enduring legacy of women by lifting up histories that describe the present and define the future. Tonight, we are joined by authors Michelle Duster and Essence McDowell, who both are re-inscribing the legacy of Black women on the South Side of Chicago and those women's impact nationally and internationally. The presentation and conversation to follow will reinvigorate our collective demands for policies that serve the public good, champion human rights, and demand justice. This program supports the museum's current exhibitions: Why Women Should Vote, titled after 1910 essay by Jane Addams that traces women's voter education in Illinois and highlights Ida B. Wells and the history of racism within the suffrage movement. The second exhibition, True Peace, the Presence of Justice, titled after a phrase attributed to Jane Addams, juxtaposes the international peace and human rights activism led by women in opposition to World War I with present day challenges to police and prisons, campaigns led by women and queer communities of color. You can visit both exhibitions on our website at wholehousemuseum.org. Many of you are joining us from community libraries across Illinois, whose partnership during a pandemic have made this virtual program and our virtual exhibits accessible to the public. We welcome and thank our partners from reaching across Illinois library systems, Aurora Public Library, Gail Borden Public Library, Arlington Heights Memorial Library, and Schaumburg Township District Library. Thank you for your partnership. And I want to remind everybody that we're using the Q&A function tonight. So if you're just joining us and you have questions throughout the program for our speakers, please know that we'll get to them tonight. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can also have questions in the comments and we'll gather those up for the end of the program and try to get to them near the end with our guest speakers. So please use the Q&A function throughout this evening's program. We'll track your questions. The University of Illinois Chicago, where Hull House is located, recently launched the Ida B. Wells Scholarship Fund, and that helps offset college cost for matriculating students to the University of Illinois. Right now, I want to introduce you to Caroline Sweeney, Assistant Vice Provost of Diversity and Community Engagement, who will share the significance of this fund and how you can contribute.
Thank you, Ross, for inviting me tonight to talk about an exciting new endeavor that was recently launched at UIC. On February 24, the university announced the creation of the Ida B. Wells Scholarship. This initiative has been in the works for several years and was inspired by the combined work of community and business leaders on the African American Advisory Council, the UIC Office of Diversity, and the Ida B. Wells Scholarship Committee, which is co-chaired by myself and my colleague, Dr. Phyllis Hayes. The Advisory Council has been in existence for more than several years, and after numerous presentations made at council meetings, it became clear there was an reoccurring theme that although applications were made to UIC by incoming freshmen had actually increased, African American students were not enrolling due to the financial gaps that they were experiencing, even after receiving grants from state and federal government sources. A sizable number of our students come from first-generation college-attending homes who bring all of the challenges of having low or no incomes, which of course, bar their path to attaining a higher education. The Ida B. Wells Scholarship was created to offset those gaps for housing and related educational expenses. All funds raised by the Ida B. Wells Scholarship will directly benefit UIC students who matriculate from 20 designated high schools across Chicago with over 95% African American enrollment, who graduated among the top 4% of students in their high school classes, who are admitted as new full-time undergraduate students, and who demonstrate financial need. Other scholarship application requirements include submitting a letter of recommendation, a recent transcript, and documenting out-of-classroom involvement, and along with an essay describing why they should be selected for the scholarship. It is our intention to award scholarships for spring of 2022. We are so grateful to and honored by the family of Ida B. Wells who have partnered with us on this effort. We promise the family of Ida B. Wells that UIC will be a good steward of those resources and to her good name, and will select students who are most representative of Ms. Wells' fight for education and social justice. We're also grateful for the work of Chancellor Michael Emeritus for finding an anonymous donor who will match all contributions made tonight and into the future up to $500,000. On behalf of the Ida B. Wells Scholarship Committee, my co-chair, Dr. Phyllis Hayes, and Dr. Amalia Bayadas, Vice Provost and Associate Chancellor of the Office of Diversity, I hope that tonight's viewers will consider making a contribution. All contributions are fully tax deductible. Information on how to give will be provided on a separate screen after this presentation. And finally, I want to thank Ross Jordan and the Jane Addams Whole House Museum for giving me time to present this special announcement to you.
Thanks, Caroline. We appreciate your partnership on this program tonight, and being able to support the scholarship. And as someone who probably benefited from scholarships through my education, I just know how important it is to get financial support just to go to school. So it's having access to education, Brian, that seems so significant and important. So thank you for being here tonight and sharing your words. And I'll just point folks to the chat where you can find the link. Just click on the link and it'll take you right to where you can support the fund. And feel free to share it with other folks who you think would be interested and can support. Thank you, Caroline. Last year, throughout 2020, Whole House commemorated the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment with a series focused on race and suffrage that reached thousands of people. Our 2020 Race and Suffrage series opened and closed with Michelle Duster. And tonight, Michelle joins us again after the release of her new book, Ida B. the Queen, illustrated brilliantly by Monica Anonu. I'm going to share this brightly colored book. It's absolutely fantastic. This evening, Whole House has partnered with the Silver Room, a Black-owned and operated institution, creating a global community on Chicago's South Side. You can visit thesilverroom.com to purchase a copy of Ida B. Wells. I'm going to drop the link in the chat so you can click and join and support Black-owned businesses in Chicago. Michelle Duster is a writer, speaker, professor, and champion of racial and gender equity. In the last dozen years, she has written, edited, and contributed to 16 books. She co-wrote the popular children's book, Tate and His Historic Dream, co-edited Impact, Personal Portraits of Activism, Shifts, an anthology of women's growth through change, and Michelle Obama's impact on African-American women and girls, and edited 2 books that include the writings of her great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells. She has written articles for Essence, Glamour, People, Refinery 21, HuffPost, Teen Vogue, and the North Star. Welcome back to Whole House, Michelle Duster.
Well, thanks for having me, Ross, and thank you to the Jane Addams Hull House Museum for having me again, and to Caroline Swinney and everybody at UIC who was responsible for initiating and going to steward the Ida B. Wells Scholarship. Of course, our family is very excited about that, and we obviously have a very strong value for education. So we appreciate what you're doing to not only help people remember my great-grandmother, but also to help the next generation get their education. So I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a second. Okay, so I am going to tell you as much information as I can about my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, her life and legacy, as much as I can in 20 minutes. It's a lot of information to go over in a short amount of time, but hopefully we can address, at least some questions during the Q&A. Let's see. So my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, was an educator. She started off as an educator. She segued into journalism. She's very well known as an anti-lynching crusader. She was a newspaper editor and a co-owner of a couple of different newspapers at different times. She was a civil rights activist, a co-founder of the NAACP and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. She also founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, which was the first all-Black suffrage club in Illinois. She was, by today's standards, a community organizer and a social worker, and she also was involved, in my opinion, with fair housing advocacy. So that's a brief overview of the few things that she did in her life, in addition to being a wife and a mother of 4 children. So just to explain how I'm related to her, this is her. She was born Ida B. Wells, and then she got married to Ferdinand Barnett. So she hyphenated her name, which was unusual at that time when she got married in 1895. They had 4 children together, and my grandmother, Elfrida Barnett, was their youngest child and youngest daughter. And my grandmother, Elfrida Barnett, got married to a man named Benjamin Duster. And so her last name changed to Duster. And my grandmother had she had 5 children. And her middle child was my father, Donald Duster. And then my father had 3 children. So I have 2 brothers. There are also several other descendants of Ida B. Wells through my father's siblings, as well as my grandmother's brother. So I'm just going to briefly go over the pivotal points, the turning points of Ida's life. So she was born enslaved in Holly Springs, Mississippi, which is significant as far as what influenced her life, because she grew up in a more of an urban area. She was born during the Civil War, but luckily for her, the Civil War ended when she was only 3 years old in 1865. So she had an opportunity to become formally educated, which was, she was the first generation to have that opportunity for the most part, because enslaved people, it was illegal to teach, to educate enslaved people. So her parents were not formally educated, and neither were anybody else that were her parents' generation or before. So Ida was fortunate to have the opportunity to become educated at Russ College. What is Russ College now? At the time, it was Shaw University, which was in Holly Springs, Mississippi, which was very convenient. And so she became formally educated. Her father was involved. She grew up in socially conscious, politically engaged family. Her father was very involved in political meetings, and he took advantage of the right to vote. She was the oldest of 8 children, and her job, and she explained that in her autobiography, her job, or their job, was to go to school. So instead of, working as enslaved people did for their entire lives and not becoming educated, her parents really focused to make sure that they focused on their education. And so she had a happy childhood, according to her autobiography, but unfortunately, both of her parents died within a day of each other as a result of a yellow fever epidemic that hit northern Mississippi and some parts of Tennessee. And so she became orphaned at age 16. She decided at that time, instead of having her family, she and her siblings separated from each other, that she would take care of them. And she got a job as a teacher in rural Mississippi. She did that for a couple of years before moving to Memphis, where she also was teaching. And she was teaching initially in Woodstock. And so she had to commute back and forth between Memphis and Woodstock. And she had an incident on a train. This was what started her activism, where she was asked to leave the ladies' car and to go into the colored car, which doubled as a smoking car. That was humiliating to her, and it was absolutely not separate and equal accommodation. So she sued the railroad on that basis. She originally won the lawsuit in 1884, but then it was turned over. It was overturned in 1887, 2.5 years later. So that had a real big impact on her life and her view of the world, as far as thinking that the legal system was not on the side of African American people or justice. And so she continued teaching, but she also had started writing for newspapers on the side, and she had a growing reputation as a journalist. And she decided to write an article about how the school system was separate and unequal. And as a result of that, she lost her teaching job. And so at that point, she was a co-owner of the Memphis Free Speech. And so she decided to focus all of her energy on growing the newspaper. And then her life took a real big turn when 3 of her friends were lynched. And so she decided to use her voice as the journalist in the newspaper to expose the realities of lynching, which was that it was being used as a form of domestic terrorism and not any credible way of being about justice. And she kept speaking up so much and investigating other lynchings that were happening to show that lynching was being used as a form of domestic terrorism. Her friends were the co-owners of a grocery store. They were enterprising business owners, leaders in the community. And what happened was that a white-owned grocery store, the owner decided to eliminate the competition and figured out a way to incite a situation where the Black men defended themselves. And so they were considered the aggressors and framed as being dangerous people. And we hear this kind of thing today. And I think it's important for people to understand that what we're experiencing today is a continuum, I think, of what was happening during my great-grandmother's time, where Black people are sort of framed as being these dangerous people who are creating mayhem in the community and therefore deserve to be brutalized. My great-grandmother talked about this so much. She encouraged the boycott of streetcars in Memphis, the boycott of white-owned businesses, and she also encouraged people to leave Memphis if they could afford to. And so she was so disruptive to the status quo in Memphis that ultimately her printing press was destroyed and her life was threatened. Luckily, she was out of town when this happened, and she went on to New York City, where she continued writing about what was going on in order to educate the northern part of the country about the absolute lawlessness that was taking place. And as a result of her writing and speaking about this, she was invited to go overseas to England to help the British understand what was going on. And she ultimately came to Chicago to participate in creating a pamphlet that was distributed at the World's Fair in 1893 to educate the world about what was going on in this country. And that was significant because that's where she met Ferdinand Barnett, who ultimately became her husband 2 years later. So later in her life, after she, in the 1913, she, like I said, she founded the Alpha Suffrage Club. She had gotten involved in the suffrage movement as an extension of club women's work. During this time, women did not have the right to vote, and there was a very strong club movement happening in this country where women would form clubs and work on issues to make their communities better without having the right to vote, although they did put pressure on the people who could vote in order to advocate for their issues. And so, as I mentioned, she was a co-founder of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which also had started advocating for suffrage for women. But in Chicago, my great-grandmother was involved in a couple of other organizations that were about suffrage, women's suffrage. They were predominantly white. And so in the state of Illinois, there was some, interracial kind of collaboration when it came to the suffrage movement. And in 1913, there was a parade in Washington, D.C., a suffrage parade. And so my great-grandmother went with the Illinois delegation to that parade to represent the state of Illinois, only for the organizers of the parade to ask the Black women to march in the back of the parade. And she famously now is really lauded as refusing to give in to that request. And she basically walked alongside of the parade and inserted herself into the Illinois delegation front and center. So she was involved in integrating the suffrage parade in 1913. She also got involved on a local level with helping migrants get adjusted to Chicago. This was the first wave of the Great Migration that happened at the turn of the 20th century. And mostly men were coming to this northern part of the country looking for employment in order to potentially send back home for the rest of their family. And some of them were getting caught up in either illegal activity, or they just were sort of falling through the cracks as far as finding their way. And they also were not welcome at the YMCA, which was welcoming to white men. So she and her husband Ferdinand founded the Negro Fellowship League, which was the answer to the YMCA, which provided housing for most men. And also she was involved in helping them find jobs and provided a place for people to socialize. And so she kept that running for 10 years. And one thing that's really amazing is that after the initial funding for the organization ran out, my great-grandmother actually got a job as a parole officer for a few years, and she used her salary to fund the Negro Fellowship League, which shows her level of dedication to helping other people who were not given the same opportunities as some other people in our society. This picture is significant because she has a button on here that says Martyred Negro Soldiers, December 11th, 1917. What happened was that there was a group of Black soldiers who were camped at a camp in Houston, Texas, and they were not welcome. These were Black soldiers who were going to be overseas fighting World War I. And they were not welcome. They were treated poorly by the Army and the community in Houston. And eventually a riot broke out. The Black men defended themselves. And then again, they were prosecuted for crimes, and 12 of them were hanged and several others were given life sentences. And my great-grandmother thought that was a travesty for the United States government to treat its own soldiers that way. And so she protested and created these buttons. And as a result of that, the FBI decided to surveil her and visit her, and they threatened her with treason for criticizing the government. It actually started my book, Ida B. the Queen, with this incident, because I was so fascinated by how something as innocuous as creating buttons was considered dangerous, and how my great-grandmother was not intimidated at all by even the concept or the idea of potentially going to prison for speaking out against the government. And then the last thing that she did in her life, her amazing life, shortly before she died, was in 1930. She actually ran for state senate in Illinois, which is amazing considering that was only 10 years after women gained the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. So that was pretty daring for any woman, but especially an African-American woman, considering all the barriers that there were for political empowerment for Black women. So that's a brief overview of her life. She wrote several pamphlets during her time. The first the first four that are listed on this were on this slide were about individual lynchings, and she chronicled names, dates, locations, and rationales that were used to basically create domestic terrorism in the Black community. Many times she found that the person who was lynched was either innocent of any crime, or if they were accused of Black men having liaisons with white women or violating white women, if that really were a liaison, most of the time it was consensual. And so she proved this over and over again, that what was really going on regarding lynching was a way to terrorize the Black community, to get rid of the leaders of the community, the people who were enterprising. I mean, there were basically a lot of people were lynched because they were successful. And, so it was a way to sort of create a situation, a social environment where Black people wouldn't aspire to certain things or certain roles or certain kinds of accomplishments because the fear of retribution. So she really did a great job of capturing this sort of social environment that was prevalent during our time. The last two pamphlets that are listed here that she wrote are about riots that took place in East St. Louis, Illinois, and Elaine, Arkansas. And that was a different kind of violence, because the lynchings mostly were, targeted to individual people, but the riots were about erasing or destroying mass murder and mass property destruction. And so they're actually very fascinating to read, to really understand sort of the violent world that she inhabited and was navigating. So these are some of the covers of the pamphlets that she wrote. And then my family has been involved for almost 80 years to help people remember who my great-grandmother was and what she contributed to this country. It started with my grandmother, who found Ida's manuscript for her autobiography, and she edited it and got it published in 1970. So that was almost exactly 40 years after Ida passed away. And then my personal opinion is that my great-grandmother's autobiography has been the foundation for most of the scholarship that has been generated since the publication of that in 1970. My father's generation founded the Ida B. Wells Memorial Foundation and provided in 1988, and has provided support for people who are doing work to help people remember Ida. So they provided a lot of support to the film, Ida B. Wells, A Passion for Justice, which was released in 1989. And then Paula Giddings wrote a comprehensive biography about Ida called Ida, A Sword Among Lions. And she, my father's generation, gave her a lot of information, access to documents and everything in order to help her get her book done. We also provide scholarships through our Memorial Foundation, which we give scholarships to students at Ida's alma mater, Russ College, which is an HBCU. And most of the students, again, are first generation students. So we want to help people continue getting their education. We also support public history projects that help people remember Ida B. Wells, but also we're expanding out to other women and other people who work in her vein. Several people in our family also write and do speaking about Ida. We support the Ida B. Wells Barnett Museum in Holly Springs, Mississippi, which is a house museum. And it's actually very significant because it's the house that her parents worked in as enslaved people. So you really do get a sense of where she grew up and just kind of imagine what it was like when she was living. There's a restaurant called Ida B's Table in Baltimore, which we have provided support for that honors Ida. And we also, as a family, created markers, a historical marker to remember Ida's parents, because they did die in an epidemic and there was a mass grave. So just to quickly go over the other markers, there are different cities that have created tributes to Ida. She's in museums. There was a Rose Bowl parade. There was a Rose Bowl float in the parade in 2020 that commemorated the 19th Amendment. And there were 5 descendants of suffragists who were represented on the float. And so I was one that represented Ida. The other representatives or descendants were of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. And there was recently a street codenamed after Ida in Brooklyn, she lived there for a year. Here are some other projects and honors that have been named after Ida last year. This is really fitting to me. In May 4th of 2020, she was honored with the Pulitzer Prize Special Citation. And May 4th is significant. I found it very ironic and fitting because May 4th of 1884 is when Ida was removed from the train. From the ladies' car. So you fast forward, almost 90, I don't know, I can't do the math, how many years later, and she was honored with one of the most prestigious awards possible for a journalist. So I have been involved in numerous projects to help people remember my great-grandmother. Some of you have seen Ida B. Wells Drive, which was a huge tribute to her and very fitting for what she contributed to our country. There's an honorary street as well as and a historical marker at 37th and King Drive, which is only about half a block away from her house where she lived on 24 South King Drive. And then the most recent tribute is this book that I wrote, and it was published just 2 months ago. And the point is to introduce her story to a younger audience and to help people who already know her story see how her life and legacy fits into the 400-year continuum of the Black experience in this country. And the way that she worked will hopefully inspire people to work in her tradition of speaking truth to power, to work and protest alone sometimes, to get involved in organizing, to work through different mediums to control the narrative of who we are as a people and what our experiences are. Also to get involved in politics in some kind of way, and then also be involved in institution building. So people ask, what did we learn, what kind of things have been passed down in our family, and these are the values that were passed down. Education is very strongly encouraged in our family. We were also encouraged to stand up for our rights, to believe that our voices are important, to stay focused on a goal, and to definitely not let other people define us or set limits for us. So to conclude, I love this quote by my great-grandmother, where she said, "I could no longer hold my peace, and I feel, yes, I am sure that if it had to be done over again, provided no one else was the loser save myself, I would do and say the very same thing again." And to me, that encapsulates her entire approach to life, that she lived unapologetically, and she did not have any regrets, and she truly believed in what she did. And I think you can't live a better life than that. So I will stop share, and we can start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's great to have you give us your perspective on the key moments in Ida B. Wells' life and have you narrating. It's just a powerful experience. So thank you for that. Right now, I want to also remind people that we have tons of questions in the Q&A and some in the chat. Keep on sending to them so we can get to them at the end. I'm going to invite Essence McDowell into the conversation now to talk with Michelle and get deeper into the experience of writing the book and her work. Essence McDowell is a communication strategist, organizer, and co-author of Lifting as They Climb, Mapping a History of Black Women on Chicago's South Side. She utilizes media, digital design, and communication technologies to amplify the work of community institutions and justice-based organizations. Essence has worked at numerous national and local entities, including the Illinois Humanities Council, Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, Chicago History Museum, and the Chicago Public Library. She's currently the Director of Communications at the Social Justice Initiative, which is here at UIC, and a member of the International All African Peoples Revolutionary Party. Thank you, Essence, for joining us. It's great to have you here. I'm going to drop in the chat where people can find more information about Lifting as They Climb. Welcome to the conversation, Essence.
Thank you so much, Ross. I'm excited to be here and talking to Michelle about this powerful book. Yeah, let's dig right in, Michelle. Thank you for that presentation. Every time I hear about Ida B. Wells and how much she did in her life, it really just feels like it's so empowering and encouraging to me, just on a personal level, to just be more, you know. So I want to start with so Ida B. Wells is, I think, one of the most well-documented Black women change agents in history. And when it comes to you writing about her in this book, Ida B. the Queen, I think of the origin story is such an incredible part of a writer's journey. And it helps readers to understand what is the importance of the book and also what is significant about the author who wrote the book. Mm-hmm. And you've edited, multiple compilations about Ida B. Wells, and there's been texts written about her. And so I want to talk to you about what is just your personal, what was your personal motivation for writing this book? And just kind of what brought you to kind of sharing this story in this particular way? Outside of her being, of course, being her great-granddaughter, what was your personal motivation for it?
Well, I think overall, Black women in general are underrepresented in textbooks, in public history projects, in exhibits and movies, pretty much every way that we learn about history. Women are underrepresented greatly, and this is a fact. And most history books or textbooks are between 3 to 10% are focused on women. And we can go down the line as far as statistics, even when it comes to public history projects, less than 10% of statues, less than 3% of monuments in this country focus on women generally. And then if you break it down by race, it's a fraction of all of that when it comes to Black women. So part of my motivation is to uplift Black women, specifically, and women in general, outside of being a mother of or a wife of. somebody, because that is unfortunately the way that too many women's stories are told, is through how they're related to somebody else, And so I think that women in general need to get more credit and more recognition, for what they have actually contributed to this country. So for me, my great-grandmother happens to be a historical figure. And so my attitude is, why not start with my family? Because it would be kind of weird for me to not talk about my family since I do have this history. But my focus is on overall, uplifting women's stories.
Yeah. Thank you. Absolutely. And those stats kind of, really hit my heart in a particular way, that it definitely is important for us to uplift Black women's histories. And so that kind of, do you feel like that's kind of what led you also to insert yourself into the book? Because what people will be surprised, I don't want to ruin all the surprises when they open the book, but you share some of your personal genesis in there, and you share some of your family history, but your own journey, becoming a journalist yourself, becoming a writer. And so was that a part of, I think that's also a really bold move. And I've experienced moments where it's like, do you insert yourself? Do you not? Is that a part of your thinking as to why you also included yourself in the book in a very intentional way?
Well, I mean, I feel that Ida's family is part of her legacy. People always want to talk about her work as a legacy, but isn't family legacy also? And so, I felt that was important for people to understand. She actually had a family, and what happened to her family, and what is her family doing? And so I felt that it was important to humanize her in that way, as being a matriarch, as well as a trailblazer, and an inspiration for our family, and to help. I also wanted to help younger women, in particular, when I would say included myself in the book. I wanted younger people in particular. I was very deliberate about what I chose to share about my journey and my story, so that younger women specifically hopefully would see some of themselves in my journey, because I think still to this day, women have different expectations put on them than men do, and different pressures and different ways of being judged. And so I wanted to validate, some of the concerns that some women have in me. I do teach. And so I come in contact with these, college age students that are trying to find their way in the world and define themselves, and have their own identity separate from their parents, and that kind of thing. And so I think it's important to help younger people understand that what their anxieties might be, or what their insecurities might be, are normal. Like, this is part of the growing pains. And I also was deliberate about including as much as I could about that, those aspects when it came to my great-grandmother as well. I wanted to humanize her and help people understand, yes, she did all these awe-inspiring things, but she also, had times when she didn't, doubted herself, or where she, there, so little things like she struggled with money, when she was in her 20s, and didn't know how she could pay all of her bills. And this is just part of life.
Right. I appreciated that very much so about the book, and in the way that she felt more like, someone that I've seen in community, someone I've known had some worries and challenges in a way, because sometimes it could seem like Ida B. Wells is a superhero, right? She's like a journalist and she's doing anti-lynching campaigns, but I do definitely see how you kind of work that into the book. But before we get into Ida B. Wells as much, I'm excited about this book, and I really could not wait to kind of gush about the beautiful modernized format of this book. It has such vibrant illustrations, colorful ephemera, historical documents. You even have FBI files, court documents, and there's just so many elements that bring Ida B. Wells' story to life. And I think that's a great idea. I'm biased because of Lifting as They Climbed and really understanding that students feel so separate from history now. So I wanted to ask you, like, you know, can you speak to like what made you go into this like aesthetically pleasing format and visual direction of this book?
Well, I mean, a lot of the material and a lot of the realities of my great-grandmother's life were very violent. I mean, you know, lynching isn't that a pretty thing. And, you know, racial violence when it comes to riots, you know, and just mass destruction of communities is not an easy thing. And, you know, some of the rationales that were being, the crimes that people were charged with or accused of is not a pretty thing. And so, you know, a lot of times people can feel uncomfortable, you know, sort of examining this difficult part of our country's history and difficult part of our country's reality still to this day, actually. And so, you know, to sort of counteract that, you know, that there is a visual component to the book that sort of, I think, balances it out, like the difficult topic with the aesthetically pleasing, you know, visuals. I think, you know, incorporating primary sources also makes it real to see, you know, the letters and, you know, different documents that really, it's real history. It's not like we're just like this some intangible concept.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that's really what it did for me, especially to just read those FBI documents and see like how they were referring to Ida B. Wells. And, you know, there could be this conversation around, oh, they were a part of the government trying to protect certain things, but then why are these letters written this way? Why are these documents showing like a certain undertones that you wouldn't necessarily get if you were just reading about the document versus reading the document? So yeah, I think it's really a powerful tool and mechanism that you use in the book. And so in the book, you weave Ida B. Wells' life into over 400 years of rich intellectual, political, and cultural legacies that make up Black history. And you kind of braid her story into many narratives, including, like, I believe you included Bree Newsome, Colin Kaepernick, in this larger historical timeline that shows not just what Ida B. Wells did during her life, but then what happened after her life to memorialize her and things of that nature, but specifically around including contemporary figures, contemporary activists. What was it what was it about that choice? Like, what made you decide to expand the book, expand it beyond Ida B. Wells' life and include so many important figures?
Well, I mean, I think that the work that my great-grandmother was doing is unfinished. And so to help people understand how what is going on today is connected to the past. You know, nothing happens in a bubble. You know, there are influences that happen. And I mean, personally, you know, you look at what happened on January 6th, 2021 in Washington, D.C. That didn't happen out of nowhere. You know, there is a long legacy of this kind of, you know, mentality that would lead to people storming the Capitol. And so where does this come from? It didn't happen yesterday. And so it's the same thing when it comes to the resistance movement as well, right? So, you know, you go from, my great-grandmother was born during the Civil War. She grew up during Reconstruction. She experienced post-Reconstruction, which was a backlash against Black progress. And she lived through a reign of terror in this country, and through World War I and all of the, you know, this demand for patriotism from people who were not being treated as first-class citizens in this country. And then for the World War I veterans to come back to this country and be met with, you know, hatred and second-class citizenship, and that's what led to the riots. And so she died in 1931, but then you fast forward just a little more than 10 years after she died, you have World War II, and you have a whole nother wave of, just sort of negative attitudes when it came to the veterans from World War II. All of the continued migration. I mean, it's just a continuum. And I think in order to understand where we are today in 2021, people have to be able to look back 150, 160 years and see that there has been a continuous sort of progress followed by backlash when it comes to our experience in this country. There is a pattern. And so what happened in January of 2021 is a pattern that we have seen over and over again now that there has been this period of time from when the Civil War ended until now, So I think it's important for people to understand that we are continuing the work that my great-grandmother and her contemporaries were doing.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I feel like this is the most, it was so like, it feel like we just lived through, 2020 somehow, and we end up here, and it happened so quickly that has there been enough time to process what's happened? That's up for anyone, depends on your personal experience. But what you did was you also included Trump, you included some of Obama's response to racism and things like that. And so is it to tie in like Ida B. Wells's legacy directly to political progress, or to critique it in a way to say that there's been some failures to our system?
I think it's just to give people a chance to think. My hope with the book is that there can be dialogue, that the book will lead to people kind of thinking about where we are today and seeing how it is connected to her life, and then what has happened since then. And if there can be, group discussions, or if there's, if it can be incorporated into curriculum. I mean, there's just a lot of space for people to actually have conversations about this dynamic. And that's my hope with it, is instead of me telling people what to think, this will give people a launching pad of different information that they can actually analyze and come up with their own ideas about what does this all mean.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great response. Thank you for that. There's so many important Black women's legacies that I learned just through my own personal research that get either erased or just unincorporated into mainstream accounts of history as a whole. And even when it comes to Black history, Black women often fall in the footnotes. And so I was particularly drawn to the sections of the book where you insert like the story of Reese Taylor, a Black woman sharecropper, and who was raped by 6 white men. And you also include Sarah Bartman, who many people don't even know who Sarah Bartman is. Her name is definitely not in history books as much. And so why was it important for you to share these Black women's histories in the book? And can you share a little bit more about, your process of like uncovering these stories and integrating them into Ida B. Wells' story?
Well, I mean, I do actually read a lot. And so a lot of the stories that I incorporated into the book I already knew about. And so when I was thinking about the challenges that my great-grandmother faced, and the work that she did, and the realities of Black women during her time, some of the stories that you mentioned were what came to my mind when I was thinking about Black women have a different history and a different reality, different experiences than any other women in this country. Our situation is unique, and we've had different challenges and barriers that are very unique to us. And what I was doing when it came to Sarah Bartman and Reese Taylor, and I also included the women in Oklahoma, Oklahoma City, who had been brutalized by the police officer, and there are numerous other stories. I mean, I couldn't incorporate everything, but these were examples of how Black women have a higher level of danger, have to navigate a world that doesn't have the same value for us as women as it does specifically when it comes to white womanhood. And that's very evident when it comes to how the Black community was brutalized in the name of protecting white women. So on the one hand, you have, you know, an incredible level of violence in the name of protecting one group of women, but then on the other hand, you know, Black women, you know, are not even, you know, regarded in the same level as a woman, and that was evidence when it came to my great grandmother getting thrown off the train. That she was on a lady's car. She's a lady. She's on the lady's car, but she wasn't considered a lady enough to be on the lady's car. So Black women have, you know, always had this sort of separation of being considered and treated with dignity and respect as a woman in the same way that, I mean, you know, this is our history. This is about how white women have been treated and regarded compared to, you know, how my great grandmother's a Black woman was treated and regarded. And that has continued after she died when it comes to, you know, well, not my great grandmother was alive during Reese Taylor's situation, but this continuing sort of lack of humanizing Black women, we can still see remnants of that today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And there's so many stories that folks just aren't made aware of, you know, in conversations about history and contributions in Chicago and beyond, that Black women have been at the helm, that Black women have built so many institutions and organizations. And Ida B. Wells really highlights that in a lot of ways. You also speak to this political lineage that Ida B. Wells is a part of, like intentionally being a part of government shifts and changes, as Ida B. Wells was the first Black woman, one of the first Black women to run for public office in the nation. And so can you speak about a little bit about Ida B. Wells and her political trajectory? I think some people do know the history of her being a journalist. They do know her being an activist, but as a political, you know, a political conduit trying to create change. What have you found out about your great grandmother about her political involvements?
Well, one of the first things that the Alpha Suffrage Club did was created a block system when it came to registering people to vote. And her goal was to have Black women register to vote in a way so that they could have an impact on who became the political leaders. Specifically, that was for the Second Ward, which now part of it is the Fourth Ward. And so this idea that there can be self-determination from a political standpoint, you know, was appealing to her because, okay, so now we have the right to vote as women. Well, how are we going to use our voices and our power as voters to impact change and to have input into who's representing us, and will that person represent our interest? And so these women, you know, canvassed the Second Ward. They were met with resistance, you know, because she talks about how some husbands of some of the women, you know, were not comfortable with the idea of their wife voting. And so they had to basically sell the men on the idea of women voting in order to have agency when it came to Black people overall having a voice. And so obviously they were effective, and they were influential in helping Oscar DePriest become the first Black alderman in the city of Chicago in the Second Ward. And then, I mean, it just kind of went on from there because they obviously made waves when it came to showing their power. So it expanded when it came to the mayoral race during that time. And then Oscar de Priest actually became congressman, during that time in 1928. So she was like, roll up your sleeves, grassroots, door to door knocking, to get people politically involved. And that's why I included Stacey Abrams in my book, because I think that she's doing a phenomenal job. It's probably not intentional on her part, like I'm going to be like Ida B. Wells, but she is. She's doing the same type of work, that my great grandmother was doing. And so I think it's important to recognize that, it didn't start yesterday, not to take anything away from what people are doing now, but people also need to realize that they're standing on shoulders.
Yes.
And they're continuing in the same tradition.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I haven't read any history books as of late that do such an excellent job of kind of juxtaposing the present with the past, and to really give even young people, an idea about like what's happening right now with Stacey Abrams, with Maxine Waters, that they are a part of the Ida B. Wells legacy, to put those two side by side, I think was a really powerful element too for me. I have two more questions. I know we're probably getting close up to Q&A time, so I hope folks are, thinking of their questions if I'm not getting at them with mine. The monument for Ida B. Wells was a major project for you over the years, and you ultimately succeeded in getting the funding and the support to make it happen. Did some I know it took Herculean organizing over years to make that actually like going to be in Chicago, to make that a space in Chicago. And in your presentation, you mentioned other markers and monuments dedicated to Ida B. Wells around the nation, which is really, really beautiful. But on the other hand, this past year, there's been a push to tear down racist statues and monuments in various cities. And I think with this removal, there becomes a question of when you tear things down, what goes up in replacement, and who gets acknowledged, and who determines whose histories get cemented in these cities and in these neighborhoods. And so can you just talk a little bit about the importance of place in the geographical memorialization of Black women in history, and why is that like a significant element to be addressed?
Oh, wow, that's a lot. I mean, well, I'll just give a little bit of background on the Ida B. Wells Monument. So first of all, what happened was that there was an Ida B. Wells public housing community that was very significant on the south side of Chicago in Bronzeville, and it stood for over 60 years. It had over 1,600 units, and thousands of people lived there over the 6 decades. And there was a decision in 2002 with this plan of transformation to tear it down. And so as a result of that decision, there was a question of, okay, if you're going to tear down this significant housing community that was named after Ida B. Wells, we can't have her name fade from memory, because she was a woman, she was not a building. And so that's where the idea of having a monument came from. It wasn't out of nowhere. It was about like, you cannot tear down an entire community and not replace it with something that honors her. And we made a decision to have the monument on the land where the Ida B. Wells homes were, to keep it local and very specific to her story and the story of the community of Bronzeville, because we will have other components of this larger vision to incorporate, information about the whole community, because she was part of the community. She was, a well-known person in the community, but the community itself has a very strong history, which Essence, and thank you for for your work to help people remember all of this rich history in the community and all the other women who lived in this area. But as far as where Black women's space is, and the idea of place. I mean, this is an ongoing discussion. There are now several initiatives that are happening in different cities. We have the Chicago Monuments Project here in Chicago. In New York City, there's a She Built NYC initiative. In the state of Virginia, there was a commission, created about women's history. And so I'm seeing this in different states, going on around the country, where there is this dialogue of how can we live in a society that is 51% female, but only 5% of the monuments are a tribute to women, and only 10% of the statues. I mean, just to give perspective, there are about 5,500 statues in this country. 1,700 of them are to Confederate leaders. And there are only around 500 statues to women. So we have almost 3 times as many statues to Confederate leaders than there are to women. So we have a long way to go when it comes to women being represented in public spaces. And unfortunately, a lot of the women statues that you might see are not even real women. They're like goddesses.
Right.
And so, we have a long way to go. And this is something that I really do care about, because I think it matters. I think representation matters, not only for females to see themselves represented, but I think it's important for men to see women represented in these spaces, because it gives equity when it comes to who contributed to this country and who should be celebrated and recognized. And only having 5 to 10% representation of women is not at all equitable.
Yeah, not at all. Also goes to show, like, well, what is it that they want people to remember? You want people to remember Confederates who, killed people and were trying to protect slavery? Or is there a broader scope of American history that we can begin to think about? And also a community history that's missing. I think on a national level, there's a lot of different, like, historical American statues, but then in our communities, there are spaces where powerful things happen. And I think you get to that with the Ida B. Wells homes that were once there and aren't there anymore. And if you I've walked past Ida B. Wells homes, it's a huge, in Chicago, for those who aren't in Chicago, it's a huge, it looks like 3 football fields long, a field that's just nothing there. And if you don't know about Ida B. Wells's history in life, and if you don't know what used to be there because you're not sure in community, because there's nothing there to say, that you would just walk past this really important space in Chicago community without knowing who it was important to and what impacts some significant figures throughout history had in that space. So yeah, it's so much. There's so much you get at with this book. There's so much to be told, even still, about Ida B. Wells' legacy. And so if you can just share a little bit about, like, where people can, like, find out more about the book, and also, why is it important for them to get this book and share it with who would you like them to share it with? What kind of impact would you envision it having? Any of those things would be great.
Right. You know what? Before I get to that, I just remembered, I just needed to correct myself. There are 1,700 tributes to Confederate leaders, but there are about between 700 to 800 statues. So the other tributes are other things like schools named after them and streets named after them and that kind of thing. So not 1,700 statues, but 1,700 tributes.
That's the particular message that's pretty obvious,
Yeah. But as far as what I hope people get from this book is obviously learning about who my great-grandmother was, what the work that she did, but also, hopefully they can see themselves in her, be inspired by her, and, study, some of the tactics that she used, some of the strategies that she used to affect change, and and get some ideas on how all of us can make an impact. It doesn't have to be, you're going to become a historical figure and be in all of the history books and statues and this and that. But I mean, we all can make a difference in our communities. We can make a difference in our schools, in our churches, different organizations that we're part of. Everybody has the capability of making a change and an impact. And even if it's on a family level, that is all, it's all important. And so I really hope that people can see how they can make a difference when it comes to, just pushing our country forward, for freedom, justice, and equality for all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say thank you for writing this book. I think that it, even I just really enjoyed it. I think that it will be such a valuable resource, especially in schools. I know teachers are always looking for ways to kind of infuse Black history, to better understand Black women's history. And you do that with this book. And I think that it's also really accessible for young people to be able to get engaged and really understand the connections of the past to their present moment, the things that they've seen unfold in the last 2 years. You make it so relevant and so current. So I really hope that folks get a chance to get this book, to read it, to see it. Make sure you get your copy, because it's a powerful resource. It's a powerful resource. So thank you so much for talking with me today, Michelle. I think you're doing such great work. I'm so happy.
Thank you, Essence.
Thank you, Michelle and Essence. That was fantastic. We have questions. We have a ton of questions, so we're going to try to get to some of them in the next 10 odd minutes here. But if there's other ones, keep sending them in, and maybe we can compile them and get some answers later on. But there are a lot of questions about Michelle, your relationship with Ida B. Wells, if you remember her, or if there were stories, I guess, from her, that got passed down that might be something that would only pass through, the kind of family lingo. People were asking questions about that particularly in your relationship with her through, I guess, time.
Well, my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, died in 1931. And I was not born before 1931. And so I do not remember her. She died several decades before I was born. But I do remember her daughter, Alfreda Duster, was my grandmother. And so I knew my grandmother very well. I spent a lot of time with her. So my grandmother would talk about her mother in sort of general terms, because I think it's important for people to remember that I was a child for most of the time that my grandmother was alive. And so she sort of tempered, the extent of the detail that she shared with me about what her mother did, because it's violence. I mean, how much do people want to share about people getting burned alive and, having fingers cut off for souvenirs and, all these type of things. So I was always told that my great grandmother was a journalist, that she wrote about, that she fought for justice and equality, and she spoke the truth. It was like those kind of vague ways of describing what she did. So what my grandmother did more often was just talk about sort of the values of I think when I think back on it, I think what my great grandmother went through, as far as the level of loss that she experienced and the amount of violence and death threats and all these things that she endured. My grandmother I think she was trying to shield us, from some of that, and stay in school, make sure that you, stay focused on your studies. And she always would tell us, nobody can take from you what's inside of your head. So, the idea that, my great grandmother lost everything, when her printing press was destroyed and she was exiled from the South, but she had herself, she had her dignity, she had her ideas, she had her talent. And so these are the kind of things that we were told.
That's super great. And thinking of the printing press and the kind of struggles that Ida faced, as a journalist, as an author, as a writer. And I'm very much thinking about you two as also authors and writers and tellers of truth in history, trying to transmit information to us. People, a lot of folks are asking well, what support did she receive, through her journalistic lifetime, what other organizations were supporting the work she was doing, who in her life was supporting her while she was, in Mississippi, in Brooklyn, in Chicago. What kind of reports did you receive on her journey?
Well, one of the reasons why in the book that I included working and protesting alone is because there were moments where she was absolutely on her own. And she made it clear, if you read through the lines of her autobiography, that she did feel frustrated at times, or, that she was working alone. But then when it comes to individual people or organizations, I mean, she also, she was involved with as I said, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. She was one of the co-founders of the NAACP and worked with them for a short amount of time. She was very active with the National Equal Rights League with William Monroe Trotter. They were very like-minded, and they collaborated quite a bit. They actually went together to visit President Woodrow Wilson to confront him about how he was resegregating the federal government at the time. So my great-grandmother and William Monroe Trotter were considered to be militant and compared to some other people, there were camps. I mean, the thing about history, and I'm sure anybody who has really kind of looked at, different periods in our country's history when it comes to any kind of movement or struggle, is that there are different strategies and there are different ideas on how to approach these problems. And so my great-grandmother was considered militant, along with William Monroe Trotter, compared to some other of her contemporaries that were considered more sort of conciliatory and maybe easier to get along with. So I mean, and many times she was the person who spearheaded, the initiatives when it came to like the Alpha Suffrage Club, and but she kind of wove in and out of working with people, organizing, starting organizations, but then also sometimes working by herself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciate that kind of fractured nature of organizing, because it's both personal relationships people are building and also goals are trying to meet, and that might mean that they're starting something and moving away from it. And I like that acknowledgement in the book is really fantastic, because it like Essence said, it kind of fits with people's reality experience with working on social justice issues all the time. Essence, I kind of want to actually direct a question to you that you actually set Michelle to, or gave Michelle, which is around like the motivation of writing these kinds of books. And I really do want to point people to listening as they climb. I dropped a link in the chat to Essence's co-created work. It's a beautiful website and a beautiful walking tour of Chicago that you can experience if you're not in Chicago. So I really kind of ask people to go to that. But I want to just, if you could talk, Essence, about the motivation for doing that book based on really where you live in your neighborhood.
Yeah, so Lifting as They Climbed is a guidebook that features 48 Black women who helped to contribute to build the city of Chicago and also had a national impact as well. And so we tell their stories by taking the readers on like a tour to the sites that represent their lives. And it was really an important text, I think, because once we started to do the research, it was really clear, similar to what Michelle is saying, that Black women's history is not in history books somehow. It's missing from history books, and it's also not well known in communities. And so, the book seeks to situate this really important like national and local legacies like in front of people, so that people can walk the footsteps of these dynamic organizers and educators, and artists, And I think it's important because there's even some locations that have been erased. And so if no one really actually knows about these Black women's histories, the impact that they had, just about the legacies that they left, then you can tear down a historical building and no one fight for it because they don't know, And so there's a piece of it that is about community reclaiming space and not allowing the city, which oftentimes attempts to bulldoze a lot of like important Black history homes. I think one really important example of that is the Phyllis Wheatley home was up for demolition. And the Phyllis Wheatley home was a really important site for Black women to come in and have like space that they need, resources that they need, coming up after the Great Migration, when folks didn't have as much access to resources. And just throughout Chicago's history in the 20th century, it's an important site. And so if folks didn't know that home existed and weren't really privy to like what types of community resources came out of that space, then the city can just say, because the home is having structural issues, just take it down, just demolish it. You also have that with they just saved Emmett Till's home, the home of Emmett Till that he, grew up with his family. And so but people know about Emmett Till, he's one of the most famous cases around like racism, during the civil rights era. So I think we wrote the book because people have to know these histories in order to protect them. They have to know the histories in order to be inspired by them and to understand what power exists within our communities and within ourselves.
Go check out this website. I'm telling y'all. Speaking of histories, things that are lost, things that aren't known, I'm always struck by the list of kind of key events, kind of violent events that Ida B. Wells lifted up and tried to reframe as something that needed to be addressed. And a couple of people asked this question is, did Ida B. Wells write about the 1919 race riots in Chicago? The ones I think sprung by Eugene Williams, murder on the Southside Beach. I can't remember the name of the street.
I mean, she was there, and apparently she did write letters to the mayor. I mean, she didn't write a book or a pamphlet about the 1919 riots, but she did write newspaper articles and letters before the riot happened to basically encourage people in leadership positions in the city of Chicago to take seriously the tension that was increasing over a period of time, that she could tell that things were going to continue to escalate. So she basically implored the mayor to address, some of the things that were happening. It wasn't, I mean, there were a couple of bombings that took place before the riot. And so, I think everybody in the city could kind of feel the tension, and it was ignored. And then it just kind of, exploded on that date in August. So yeah, I mean, so what I've read about her response to the riot was that she went out in the streets after, in the evenings during the middle of the riot to kind of inspect things and see what was going on. And nobody else in her family did that. I mean, her husband and children were like, you go ahead and do that, knock yourself out, which I think is kind of interesting too, that she just couldn't help herself. Like she had to go and see what was happening.
That's great to hear. And I think it's interesting. And this question always comes up between Jane Addams and Ida B. Wells and what the relationship was between them as people who were, Ida B. Wells is certainly one of the most famous Black women in the United States during her lifetime. Jane Addams, during the height of her abilities and power and reach, certainly the most prominent suffragist, nationally and certainly internationally in some circles. So, but they lived, in the same city at the same time, these kind of huge figures. Jane Addams actually wasn't in the city of Chicago during the 1919 riot. She was away and came back afterward, was a part of a panel about the riot, kind of discussing some of the where things bubbled up, right, or how things happened. But in my reading of it, she seemed distant, right? She seemed a little distant. But could you, I guess, talk about the relationship between Jane Addams and Ida B. Wells, and particularly, I guess, about their Ida B. Wells' approach to Jane Addams, her approach to Jane Addams. And I think of Jane Addams as someone who people can relate to as someone doing a lot of positive work, but getting also a lot of things not like wrong about things too. So can you just speak to the relationship and where Ida B. Wells, where she kind of, how she navigated Jane Addams?
Well, I can only speak about what she wrote about Jane
Yeah.
Addams,
Okay.
which was not a lot. I mean, she did mention how there was an effort during a period of time when the city of Chicago was considering segregating the public schools, which I know for today would seem like incredible, like that there was a time when it was not segregated.
Mhm.
But, you know, we have to remember that Chicago became, you know, more higher percentage of Black people after the migration, after the first wave, and then obviously after the second wave. So in the early 1900s, the racial makeup of Chicago was different than it is today. So the schools were integrated, and there was an effort or an idea to segregate them. And my great grandmother went to the mayor and to talk about this, and he ignored her. And so then Ida solicited the help of Jane Addams, because she, obviously they knew each other, and she knew that Jane had a level of influence that would be different than what Ida would have on her own. So she solicited the help of Jane to, have an allyship when it came to this effort to segregate the schools. And Jane Addams did take it upon herself to host meetings and speak to people in positions of power on that issue. And so, at least during that period of time, the initiative or the effort to segregate the schools was postponed, we could say, because it actually ended up, being pretty successful based on housing later on in the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's perfect. That's great. That's great. I think that narration of their kind of history is really fantastic. They obviously were working together in some occasions, but not without tension or struggle, right? Which I think is important to note. We're almost out of time. There are questions that we're just not going to get to. I'm really, really sorry to folks. One question that's kind of general, but I think like always important, is how does women's history actually reach schools, education areas, informal education areas like museums? What do you all think is the best way that students can actually get this information, learn it, incorporate it into their classrooms experience, incorporate it into their everyday lives? What helps with that? I mean, this book is like easily my answer, and also Essence's website, also my answer. And of course, I work at a historical site that's about women's history. But can you just talk about the significance of teaching women's history in educational spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think what could help, teachers be able to teach it better is that they have access to the book. So when we did Lifting as They Climbed, we did workshops with Chicago public school teachers through CTU, the Chicago Teachers Union. And what we heard from the teachers is that they, to have access to books that, like, Ida B. the Queen that Michelle wrote, it helps them largely because unfortunately they can't teach anything that they didn't learn themselves. And so if folks really want to donate books to schools, I think that's an excellent way to get it to their students, because if the teachers have access to the books, they can find ways to incorporate it into their syllabus. I think that would even be, especially during the summer when they're kind of building out their curriculums for the year, if, folks donate books to teachers and donate books to schools so that they are able to just grab this text from the shelf, like Michelle's book, like Ida B. the Queen is 400 years in there. So you could pick it, you can pick any era that you want to talk about and figure out how Black women's history intersects and figure out how Black history intersects. So I think it's about getting the resources to the teachers, because teachers are already juggling so much. And it's hard to think that they would just then, they do have to spend hours and hours to develop the lessons that they teach. So how do we make it easier for them to just teach and to have the resources that they need to teach students in a way that's interesting and engaging.
Yeah, Michelle, I know you're talking all the time advocating, but do you have any other hits, tips, or ideas about access to this information?
I mean, I think it's, I absolutely agree with what Essence said. Obviously making the materials easily accessible to teachers would be greatly helpful. But I think overall, we need to, as a society, put a higher value on learning and being exposed to and recognizing the importance of women's contributions to this country. I mean, there are people who make decisions about what will be included or excluded or marginalized or barely mentioned or in the margin or in an asterisk in a footnote in textbooks. And so I think it's a structural issue when it comes to who are the decision makers when it comes to deciding what is going to be included or not in textbooks, what is going to be included or not in curriculum. So yes, individual teachers can have advocacy, they can have agency when it comes to their class, but if we're talking about from a societal standpoint, we have a ways to go when it comes to that. And I've seen it up close and personal. I did work at an educational publisher for a little while. And so I got a sort of an insider's view into the discussions that take place about what will be included or not in the actual textbook that is distributed across, districts and entire states and that kind of thing. There has to be a higher consciousness level on from a societal standpoint. And I know that's like a really lofty kind of thing, but I really think that's what it will take.
Thank you, Michelle. I think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right. So I'm gonna continue to point people to the Ida B. Wells Fund at UIC to continue to support that, find out more about it. So students in the future can benefit from having a great public education. If you want to learn more about Hull House and what we do, you can visit hullhousemuseum.org. I want to thank Michelle, Duster, and Essence. That was a powerful conversation, an important conversation. It's so good to have two authors talking to each other. That just makes me so excited. Please visit the website for Lifting as They Climb and purchase Ida B. Wells, Ida B. the Queen, at our book partners on the silverroom.com. I want to thank our library partners and again, our good friends at the Office of Diversity, the Vice Provost of Diversity, Caroline Sweeney, and Michelle and Essence. Thank you again for this conversation. If you missed something or want to come back to this conversation, you can find it at our YouTube channel at hullhousemuseum.org as well. And again, follow us on Facebook and Twitter to find out what we're doing the rest of this year. Michelle, Duster, and Essence McDowell, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Have a good evening.